It was the year 1834, in the Appalachian folds of Kentucky, when whispers first spread of two children whose very presence unsettled an entire settlement. Their names, though still spoken in hushed tones by descendants who refused to forget, belonged to twin girls scarcely 9 years of age. They were not witches, though some called them so. They were not prophets, though their words carried the ring of fate. They were simply children, but ones who knew things that no living soul should ever know. The story that follows is not folklore. It exists in records, handwritten court transcripts, sermons copied into fragile leather-bound journals, testimonies sealed by judges and clerks. Yet what these documents describe, no science of the 19th century, nor even of our own age, has adequately explained. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The twins were Eliza and Catherine Harrow, daughters of Ezekiel Harrow, a tradesman turned preacher who had moved his family into the secluded valley of Ashford Hollow in late spring. The Hollow was a settlement with only 16 years of history, but already laden with secrets. Its wooden homes leaned against the ridges like weary men at rest. Its small church was darkened by smoke-stained rafters, and its graveyard stood older than the town itself, rows of stones marking those who had vanished under natural causes few could quite describe. Ezekiel Harrow sought peace. He was a widower of 38, a man hardened by years of wandering work, whose health had begun to falter under the burden of solitude. His twin daughters were his only comfort, children with flaxen hair and pale eyes who spoke in voices eerily matched, as though one mind lived between them. To most they were quiet, even gentle, but those who listened too long to their words often found their stomachs uneasy, as though they were hearing truths they were never meant to know. On their first Sunday in Ashford Hollow, the Harrows walked into the weather-worn church with its unpainted boards and faint smell of damp earth. The congregation, suspicious of outsiders, watched close. Pastor Samuel Pierce, a man whose sermons were built as much on thunder as scripture, welcomed them with the stern courtesy owed to any traveler seeking God's house. The twins sat side by side in the pew, their small hands folded, their gazes fixed on the wooden cross that hung crooked above the pulpit. The first disturbance came not from the pulpit, but from the children. When the final hymn ended and the congregation began to disperse, Catherine Harrow tugged her sister's sleeve and whispered too loud for comfort, "The ground beneath us isn't holy." Her voice, clear and simple, carried through the church like a struck bell. Silence fell. Pastor Pierce turned, startled, but said nothing. Eliza then added, as if to complete her sister's thought, "There are bones under the floor, not laid in rest but forced down, bound by stones." The congregation stared, unsure if this was childish fancy or something far darker. Elder John Whitcomb, one of the town's founders, coughed and barked at the girls to hush. Their father, red-faced, gathered them quickly and apologized, muttering about tired minds and fevered dreams. But the words had already sunk deep into the listeners' minds, unsettling their notions of safety in the sanctuary. Over the weeks that followed, the Harrow twins unsettled the Hollow further. Their knowledge of things unspoken proved uncanny. They asked one woman why her brother's body had been left in the river gorge, a fact she had never confessed to a soul. They spoke to another man of coins hidden in his barn rafters, coins no one else knew he had stolen on the road. They wept once, in the middle of worship, murmuring in unison, "The Whitmers never had a chance." The Whitmer family, father, mother, and 3 children, had perished in a cabin fire more than a decade prior. It was widely accepted as accident, a lantern tipped and oil catching the dry pine. But the twins' tears carried another suggestion, one that twisted the congregation's stomachs, that the fire was no accident, and the Whitmers' voices had been whispering still. It was during this time that the Harrows began to live under a shadow. Ezekiel tried to silence his daughters, but their utterances seemed to escape them, unbidden and unstoppable. At times they spoke in the night both at once, their voices carrying from their cabin in chilling synchrony. At times they fell into silence for hours, listening to things others could not hear, and when they did speak, neighbors swore they spoke not as children but as weary souls, as though they carried decades of grief beyond their years. By midsummer, Ashford Hollow was no longer able to ignore them. Rumors spread that the Harrows had brought witchcraft into the valley. Pastor Pierce urged caution, warning the flock against false spirits clothed in innocent guise. Yet others whispered differently, that the children were touched not by hell but by heaven, sent to expose secrets long buried. One evening, after a prayer meeting in which the twins sat in eerie stillness, Elder Whitcomb rose and denounced them openly. He accused Ezekiel Harrow of raising sorcerers, of using his daughter's unnatural speech to undermine the church's authority. The argument swelled, voices rising like thunder in the wooden wall. It was then that Eliza, her face pale but calm, turned her gaze upon Whitcomb and said, "You know what you buried, you know where." The words froze him where he stood. His wife clutched his arm and his face drained white. He sputtered but said no more. The room erupted in frightened whispers, and Ezekiel carried his daughters away before fury could boil into violence. But the words would not leave the room. In the nights that followed, groups of men gathered at the tavern, whispering of what might lie beneath their settlement. The church itself, some recalled, had been built swiftly in 1819, after an unusual influx of funds. Where had the money come from? Why had Whitcomb and two other elders grown suddenly prosperous at that time? By August, suspicions had hardened. A strange unease hung over Ashford Hollow like the air before a storm. Travelers along the mountain roads spoke of the settlement in fearful tones, warning others that the church itself felt wrong. Families within the hollow argued in hushed voices, unwilling to speak openly but no longer able to ignore what the Harrow twins had stirred. The children themselves grew more fragile. They slept little, their eyes shadowed as though they bore the grief of dozens. At times they refused to eat, saying the voices around them made their stomachs sick. At times they woke screaming, crying out names of men who had vanished along the old trails years before. Ezekiel Harrow, desperate, wrote in his private journal, a book that would later become evidence, that he feared his daughters were channels for truths not born of flesh. He prayed for deliverance but found none. Instead, the voices through the girls grew clearer, more insistent, and always led back to the same dark suggestion that Ashford Hollow was founded on a crime too great to remain hidden. And so, by the final weeks of summer, the community stood divided between those who believed the twins instruments of God, revealing a truth buried 16 years, and those who saw them as a curse, a corruption that must be silenced before it destroyed what little peace the Hollow possessed. It was then, in the month of September, that the accusations would reach their breaking point, and the Hollow would be forced to reckon with the weight of its own sins, guided, unwillingly, by the voices of two children who should never have known such things. The true ordeal was only beginning. The tension in Ashford Hollow did not fade with the passing of September's first weeks. If anything, the presence of the Harrow twins seemed to grow heavier, their small bodies carrying a knowledge that unnerved all who encountered them. The settlement was a place already cloaked in silence and suspicion, and their voices had turned that silence into dread. The earliest proof came from an event that even those who denied the children's strangeness could not ignore. On the 14th of September, the congregation gathered at the church for evening prayer. The candles burned low, smoke curling toward the cracked rafters, when Eliza Harrow turned her gaze toward the floorboards at the altar and whispered, "They are not at rest." Catherine, seated beside her, echoed without hesitation, "The ones below, they wait." Her words dropped into the dim chapel like a stone into a well. Pastor Pierce stopped mid-prayer, his hand frozen over the Bible. Elder Whitcomb, seated near the front, paled visibly. A murmur passed through the benches as the congregation exchanged glances. It was Elder Whitcomb's nephew, a man named Thomas Hale, who demanded then and there that the boards be lifted. He insisted that if the children were liars, their deceit would be made plain. If they spoke the truth, then justice long delayed must be met. Pastor Pierce refused, his voice sharp with anger, but Hale persisted. "We will have no peace in this house until we know," he said, his hand shaking as it rested on the pew. That night, after the service ended, 3 men returned with lanterns. Among them was Thomas Hale, along with Elias Morton and Caleb Reed. They pried loose the warped planks at the front of the sanctuary, and the hollow beneath breathed out a stench so foul it drove them back against the wall. Beneath the church, scarcely a foot below the boards, lay fragments of bone. News of the discovery swept through Ashford Hollow before dawn. Some said it was no more than animal remains, left from the early days when the ground had been forest and swamp. Others whispered it was human. A few swore they saw skull fragments among the earth, too round, too smooth to belong to any beast of the woods. No formal investigation followed. The hollow had no sheriff of its own, and the nearest magistrate rode days away across the ridges. The elders closed the church, declaring repairs necessary, and forbade anyone to disturb the ground further. But the people remembered the children's words. They remembered the look of terror on Whitcomb's face, and suspicion deepened. It was then that Ezekiel Harrow began keeping his detailed notes, the journals that survive today. In entries written between September 16 and September 28, his hand grows increasingly unsteady, the ink smudged by what appears to be sweat or tear. He writes of his daughters speaking in unison through the night, their voices echoing each other without pause. They tell me the ground sings, and they hear it even when I hear nothing. They say the blood did not soak but curdled in the dirt. They beg me to make them stop, but they cannot stop. God help them. They are only children. Neighbors began to avoid the Harrow cabin. Once Catherine was found standing barefoot in the road at dawn, whispering to no one. When asked what she was doing, she replied calmly. The ones beneath were listening. The settler who heard her swore never to speak to the child again. More troubling still was the matter of the old Whitmer fire. The Harrow twins continued to reference it, their statements pieced together over several weeks, until the story grew too detailed to dismiss. They spoke of kerosene carried in a tin, of flames struck not by accident but by design, and of a man's shadow standing in the doorway while the family screamed. One account from Ezekiel's notes records their words precisely. He closed the door. He did not open it again. They burned with their hands against the boards and no one came. The he was never named by the children, but Ezekiel hints in his writing that they looked too often toward Elder Whitcomb whenever the subject arose. By the end of September, the hollow was divided sharply in two. Half believed the twins cursed their words demonic tricks meant to sow ruin. The other half believed them divine instruments, mouthpieces for the dead whose voices had been silenced by men of standing. Neither side would relent, and both demanded action. In the meantime, the children themselves grew weaker. Neighbors described them as wan, their eyes hollowed as though fevered, their once bright hair seemed to dull, and their laughter, the laughter of children, vanished entirely. They rarely spoke to their father, except when utterances poured from them like water from a broken cistern, unstoppable and unwelcome. Ezekiel in desperation sought counsel from Pastor Pierre. The record of their meeting survives in the pastor's own hand. The father came to me with trembling, near weeping. He claims the girls suffer visions and plead with him in terror of voices. I told him plainly, Satan will wear the likeness of innocence to deceive. He must keep them close and pray without ceasing. I cannot shield them, nor him, if they persist. The pastor's words did nothing to ease the burden. If anything, they widened the rift between the Harrows and the congregation, for the family was now branded not only suspicious but dangerous. Then came the final blow of the month, the night the twins foretold a death. On September 29th, as the settlement gathered once more in the tavern hall, the church doors still nailed shut, Eliza rose suddenly from her seat. Her voice rang shrill, unlike her usual calm. Do not let him walk the ridge tomorrow. He will not return. Catherine followed immediately, her voice lower but certain. The ravine will take him. He will not come home. The man in question was Caleb Reed, one of those who had helped lift the church floorboard. He laughed off the warning, declaring he had walked that ridge 100 times and would walk it 100 more. The congregation muttered nervously but said no more. The next afternoon, Caleb Reed set out with his mule to gather timber. By nightfall the animal stumbled back riderless, its flanks scratched raw by branches. Men went out by lantern, calling his name. They found him at the base of the ravine, his skull split on the stones. The settlement fell into chaos. Half cried that the twins had cursed him, bringing death with their words. The other half claimed they had only spoken what they could not help but know. Either way, the hollow was now certain of one thing. The Harrow girls were tied to forces beyond natural explanation, and the community could not long endure their presence. In the final days of September 1834, Ashford Hollow stood on the edge of open fracture. The Harrows were isolated, shunned by neighbors who once offered bread and milk, but now crossed themselves at the sight of the children. Ezekiel's journal ends that month with a final bleak line. I fear we have wandered into a valley not of God's make. The girls are not at fault, but the voices will not release them, nor, it seems, will the hollow release us. The true unraveling was yet to come, for October would bring with it revelations more terrible than whispered prophecy. Revelations carved not only in words but in flesh and blood. October arrived in Ashford Hollow with a damp chill, the kind that seeps into bone and lingers in the rafters. The harvest came late, and the crops yielded poorly, adding hunger to the village's growing unrest. But no earthly famine stirred the people as deeply as the presence of the Harrow twins, whose every whispered word carried the weight of accusation. The death of Caleb Reed, found broken at the base of the ravine, had divided the hollow beyond repair. Where once the town had leaned on shared labor and quiet survival, now it was split into two irreconcilable camps, those who sought to cast the Harrows out, and those who demanded to hear every word the girls might yet speak. It was during these first weeks of October that the Harrow twins began speaking less in riddles and more in fragments of narrative. Ezekiel's journal notes the change with fearful astonishment.
No longer do they utter mere warnings or strange truths in passing. Now they tell of things as though they watched them happen. Fires, blood, the sound of chains. They are too young to know such horrors, and yet their voices are steady as seasoned men describing battle.
Neighbors who lingered near the cabin reported hearing both girls reciting the Lord's Prayer backward, their voices weaving in and out of each other until the words blurred into something almost unrecognizable. Others swore they heard the names of the dead men who had vanished along the mountain roads, travelers who never reached their destination. When confronted, Ezekiel insisted his daughters did not know what they were saying, that the words poured from them against their will, but the Hollow was in no mood for explanations. One evening, a group of townsfolk gathered outside the Harrow cabin, torches burning low. They demanded that Ezekiel bring the children out, that their words be tested before the people. Ezekiel refused at first, his voice trembling, but when the crowd grew restless, he relented and led his daughters to the threshold. The twins stood barefoot in the dirt, their hair pale under the firelight. For a moment they were silent, blinking at the gathered faces. Then Catherine whispered, just loud enough to carry, "You buried him in the orchard." A hush fell. She looked directly at Elias Morton, one of the men who had pried up the church floor. Her voice did not waver. "The traveler with the red scarf. You struck him, and the earth drank his blood." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Morton's face contorted, first denial, then rage. He shouted that the girls were liars, that Ezekiel had coached them to ruin honest men. Yet his neighbors drew back from him all the same, uneasy at the way his hands shook. That night, the settlement lay awake, listening to the wind scrape across the ridges, each family wondering what else the children might yet reveal. The following days brought more such utterances. In the tavern, Catherine told a woman her grandmother's grave had been robbed. An accusation proved true when the coffin was found splintered and empty. In the fields, Eliza pointed to a stone wall and murmured of bones packed beneath it like mortar. When the wall was broken open, there were indeed bones, though whether animal or human, none could say for certain. Every revelation, whether confirmed or doubted, widened the fracture in the hollow. Some whispered that the twins were prophets, chosen to expose sins long concealed. Others muttered that they were the devil's own, spreading poison that would consume them all. And always, at the center stood Ezekiel Harrow, a man hollowed by despair. His journal entries from this period are scrawled, sentences unfinished, as though written in haste between bouts of grief. I plead with them to hold silence, but they cannot. The words seize them as a fever does, and when it passes they weep as children once more. I would leave this place if I could, but where would we go? The hollow will not let us go, any more than the voices. By mid-October, the town's leaders convened in secret. Elder Whitcomb, Pastor Pierce, and 3 other men met within the shuttered church. Despite the foul air beneath its boards, their discussion, pieced together later from whispers and fragments of testimony, revolved around one question: what was to be done with the Harrows? Whitcomb argued for their removal, cast them out into the ridges, let the wilderness deal with them. Pierce hesitated, insisting that if the girls were indeed touched by infernal power, abandonment would only spread the corruption further. Others, driven by fear, urged silence by any means necessary. No decision was reached, but the seeds of violence were planted that night. Meanwhile, the twins themselves seemed caught in some strange deterioration. Their once bright faces grew gaunt, their eyes ringed with shadows. They often refused food, claiming the taste of the bread was wrong, or that the milk smelled of. They wandered barefoot into the woods at night, returning with scratches on their arms and burrs tangled in their hair, unable to explain what had drawn them there. At times they spoke in unison of things far beyond their years, detailed descriptions of wounds, of burial rites, of the precise order in which flesh decays. Ezekiel confessed in his journal that he could scarcely bear to hear them, that his stomach turned as though he were reading aloud from a medical text he had never studied. They know the progress of death as though they have watched it daily. They speak of organs failing, of skin loosening from bone, of blood thickening like pitch. These are not things they could know. These are not things any man should know. The hollow grew restless, its nights filled with uneasy silence. Dogs barked at shadows, horses shied from the Harrow cabin, and families began locking their doors with iron latches. The autumn air itself seemed charged with dread, as though the mountains were listening, waiting. Then on the night of October 19th, the twins awoke screaming. Neighbors rushed to Ezekiel's cabin, thinking fire had caught the roof. Instead they found the children writhing on the floorboards, their voices raised in a chilling duet. "He is coming back," Eliza shrieked. "No grave holds him," Catherine cried. The neighbors fled in terror, swearing the girls' voices were not their own, but carried an echo, as if many spoke through them at once. What the twins meant by he would not be understood until much later, but from that night on, the Hollow believed itself cursed beyond salvation. The Harrows had uncovered secrets that could no longer be buried, and the more they spoke, the closer the community crept toward violence, unable to silence them by reason or prayer. As October waned, the question was no longer whether the Hollow would act against the Harrows, but by late October, Ashford Hollow was no longer a place of quiet labor and shared survival. It was a place of watching eyes, of whispered threats carried through thin walls, of prayers uttered not for salvation but for protection. Where once the people gathered in neighborly trust, now every door was bolted, and every family wondered who might be named next by the Harrow twins. Even the mountains seemed to brood over the valley with unnatural weight. Mist clung to the ridges at all hours, curling between trees like pale smoke. The crows that gathered in the fields did not scatter when chased but lingered as if waiting. The Hollow's own silence had become unbearable, broken only by the sound of the girls' voices drifting from their cabin at all hours, sometimes laughter, sometimes weeping, sometimes words that did not belong to children. The Council of Fear. On the evening of October 23rd, the men of the Hollow met once more in the church, its timbers groaning as though under strain. The air was thick with dust and unease, for everyone present knew what they had come to discuss, though none wanted to say it aloud. Elder Whitcomb, gaunt and pale, was the first to speak plainly. "We cannot allow this to continue. Every day more secrets are dragged into light. Soon no man in this Hollow will be free of suspicion." Others murmured agreement. Some confessed that their own children now woke screaming, claiming to hear whispers in the night, voices not their own, yet eerily similar to the Harrow girls. Pastor Pierce, trembling, urged caution. If these children are truly afflicted by spirits, then their lives are not theirs to forfeit. We must seek prayer, perhaps even send for a bishop. But the crowd cut him off with bitter laughter. One farmer spat on the floor. "Prayer? We prayed when the church fell hollow. We prayed when Reed was found broken in the ravine. Prayer has not silenced them." The debate stretched long into the night. By its end, a grim resolve had settled upon most of the men. Though no final order was given, it was agreed that if the twins spoke again, if they named one more man or revealed one more secret, the Hollow would act. The children's decline. Inside the Harrow cabin, Ezekiel kept his daughters close, though he knew their safety was slipping beyond his grasp. The twins themselves seemed scarcely aware of the danger. They no longer played with dolls or sang childish songs. Instead they sat together by the fire, their voices weaving in and out of one another like the strands of a single thought. Their eyes grew distant, unfocused, as if fixed on sights invisible to others. At times they laughed softly at jokes no one else could hear. At other times they wept without explanation, their tears falling into the ashes. Ezekiel's journal from this week is the most disturbing yet. They speak now of things I cannot write, of fires that have not yet burned, of graves not yet dug. Their words come in riddles, yet each carries a weight that makes my marrow ache. I feel as though my daughters are already halfway gone, drawn into some realm I cannot follow. I pray, but I fear my prayers do not rise above the rafters. The naming, the breaking point came on October. A group of townsfolk gathered in the square to distribute what little remained of the harvest. The Harrows, needing grain, came despite the cold glares cast their way. For a time the exchange passed without incident, until Eliza, staring at one of the older men, whispered a single name: Jonathan. The square fell silent. Jonathan Clark froze where he stood, the sack of grain slipping from his arms. Catherine's voice followed, cold and certain. "You killed the peddler by Devil's Creek. You took his coins and burned his car." A howl of denial tore from Clark's throat, but the crowd was already shifting back from him. Eyes narrowed, suspicion sharpened to a point. No evidence was needed. The Harrows had spoken, and with that utterance, the unspoken pact of the Hollow was broken. The mob. That night a mob gathered, men with torches, women clutching rosaries, children watching wide-eyed from windows. They marched toward the Harrow cabin, their voices low but their purpose clear. Ezekiel heard them before he saw them. He barred the door, his hands trembling as he clutched the rifle that had never before left its place above the hearth. The twins sat calmly at the table, as though expecting the visitors. When the first torchlight flickered against the shutters, Ezekiel begged his daughters to flee into the woods, but Catherine only shook her head. "They're not here for us, Papa. They're here for themselves." The words chilled him more than the mob outside. The pounding began, fists and boots against the door. Voices shouted his name,
demanding the children be given over. Ezekiel shouted back, his voice breaking, "They are children, my children." But the cries only grew louder. "Witches, devil's spawn, bring them out." Their intervention. Before the door could give way, Pastor Pierce forced himself to the front of the mob. His hands shook, but his voice carried with surprising strength. "Stop this madness," he cried. "If you harm these children, you bring blood upon your own soul." For a moment, the crowd hesitated, but Elder Whitcomb stepped forward, his face contorted with fury. "Better their blood than ours. Better silence now than damnation later." The crowd roared in agreement, surging forward again. Pierce fell to his knees, clutching his Bible, but his voice was drowned out by the pounding of fists and the crackle of torches. Inside, Ezekiel clutched his daughters close. The twins did not cry. Instead, they began to hum, a strange low tune that seemed to vibrate through the very timbers of the cabin. The sound grew louder, until the mob outside faltered. Torches flickered. Men clutched their ears, some crying out as though in pain. The humming became words spoken in unison. "You built on blood, you live on blood, and now the blood will take you." Panic swept the mob. Some fled into the night, others dropped their torches and covered their ears. Only a handful, Whitcomb among them, pressed forward, their fury stronger than their fear. And then the cabin door splintered. The fracture. What happened inside remains uncertain. Some claimed to see a light burst from within the cabin, white and searing as lightning. Others swore they heard voices, dozens, perhaps hundreds, screaming from the rafters. When the smoke cleared, the cabin still stood, but the mob was scattered. Whitcomb lay unconscious on the ground, his hair turned chalk white. Several others fled into the ridges, and were never seen again. Ezekiel and the twins remained inside, untouched, but from that night onward, the hollow was never the same. Aftermath. Pastor Pierce wrote later that the hand of God, or else of hell, intervened. None could say for certain, but fear settled over the hollow heavier than ever. Families whispered of curses. Livestock sickened. Children claimed to see figures at the edge of the woods, pale and watching. The Harrows became specters in their own home. No one dared confront them again, but neither would anyone approach. Food was left on their doorstep in silence. Doors were locked tighter than before. Ezekiel himself seemed to wither, his journal entries trailing into incoherence. "I do not know if my daughters yet belong to this world. When they speak, I hear not them but others, voices upon voices, rising in judgment. Perhaps it would have been better had the mob succeeded, but I cannot forsake them. They are my blood, even if no longer my children." And so the hollow lingered in uneasy stasis, waiting for whatever doom the twins' presence promised. The reckoning had not passed. It had only begun. By November, Ashford Hollow was no longer a town, but a wound. The harvest rotted in the fields, for the people had no will to gather it. The mill wheel turned without grain to grind. Doors that once stood open to neighbors were barred fast, and smoke rose only from a handful of chimneys. The mob's failed assault upon the Harrow cabin had broken something more fragile than wood or bone. It had broken faith. The hollow was now a place of suspicion, where even whispers felt heavy with consequence. Families who once shared bread now crossed the road to avoid one another. Men who had shouted bravely at the cabin door now refused to speak of that night, as though silence could erase it. And beneath it all lay the certainty that what the Harrow twins had spoken was true. Their words were no longer prophecy but proof, waiting to be uncovered. Judge Ainsworth's arrival. Word of the hollow's unrest traveled beyond the ridges, carried by frightened relatives and itinerant traders. By early November, it reached Judge Elias Ainsworth, of Lexington, a man known both for his rigid adherence to the law and his fascination with matters unexplainable. On November 12th, he arrived in Ashford Hollow with 2 deputies and a solicitor named Marcus Webb. Their presence drew every soul from their cabins, for none had expected the law to intervene in what most considered a purely spiritual affliction. Standing in the square, the judge addressed the villagers. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of finality. "I have been told of murders long concealed, of wealth gained through blood, of children who speak with knowledge no mortal should possess. If these charges are true, then this hollow rests not upon faith but upon crime. The law must have its reckoning." The crowd shifted uneasily. Elder Whitcomb, still pale from his collapse, tried to protest, but the judge silenced him with a glance. "Tomorrow we begin excavating the church," Ainsworth declared. "If there are bones beneath its floor, we shall find." The first diggings. At dawn on November 13th, the deputies pried up the first floorboards of the Ashford Hollow church. The crowd gathered in silence as spades bit into packed earth. Dust rose, mingling with the sunlight that streamed through the warped window. It took less than an hour to uncover what the Harrow twins had already foretold. The first skeleton lay curled against the stones, its skull fractured by a blow. A rusted knife still lodged between its ribs testified to murder. The murmurs in the crowd grew frantic as more remains appeared. Bones tangled with mortar, trinkets buried with the dead. Rebecca Webb, the solicitor's assistant, catalogued each object with meticulous care. Rings inscribed with initials, buckles, a pocket watch marked with the name of a merchant known to have vanished years before. Judge Ainsworth watched grimly, his jaw clenched. "This is no accident," he said. "These are not the bones of settlers buried in consecrated ground. These are the bodies of men slain and hidden to build this place." The people of Ashford Hollow shifted their gaze not toward the dead, but toward the Harrows, for it was the twins who had spoken of these things before a single spade touched earth. The children's testimony. That evening, Judge Ainsworth summoned the Harrow family to the square. Catherine and Eliza stood before the gathering, their hands clasped, their eyes distant. Ezekiel hovered protectively behind them, though he knew no protection could shield them now.
"Children," the judge said carefully, "tell us what you know of these bones." Eliza's voice was small, yet carried clearly. "They are 11. All men. Taken along the trails between 1818 and 1820. They were robbed, then buried beneath the floor." The crowd gasped, for the number was precise, the dates exact. Catherine added, her tone flat as if reciting from memory, "Elder Whitcomb chose the victims. Samuel Frost swung the blade, Marcus Perry counted the coins, and the people of Ashford Hollow looked away." The accused men stiffened, their faces drained of color. Whitcomb sputtered with rage, but his voice cracked, betraying guilt. Judge Ainsworth, unmoved, turned to the deputies. "They will be held until trial." Chains were brought forth. For the first time in years, the Hollow saw its elders in irons. The journals revisited. As the men were taken away, Marcus Webb examined the recovered journals once hidden in the church rafters. Pages yellowed and brittle described each crime in chilling detail. Names of victims, sums of money taken, even the methods of disposing of bodies. One entry, dated June 1819, read, "Another traveler disposed of. His ring will fetch a fair sum. The Lord sees all." Yet the Lord remains silent. Perhaps silence is permission. The solicitor's hands trembled as he read. These were not the confessions of desperate men, but the calculations of deliberate murderers. When confronted, Whitcomb spat bitterly. "We did what was needed. The Hollow would not stand today without those sacrifices." His words only deepened the community's horror. The pastor's despair. Pastor Pierce, who had once defended the Harrows, found himself drowning in doubt. His church, his holy ground, had been built not upon the word but upon corpses. Each sermon he had preached now felt like blasphemy. In his journal he wrote, "I thought to save this place with prayer, but perhaps it was damned from the start. How can one consecrate a foundation of bone? Perhaps the girls are not cursed, but chosen to reveal what we could not bear to see." The twins' burden, though vindicated. The twins' burden, though vindicated. The twins grew weaker. Night after night they woke screaming, clutching their head. They spoke of voices that grew louder with each day, demanding justice, demanding rest. Ezekiel begged the judge to let them be spared further testimony, but the law required their word. And so the girls continued, speaking of crimes no one should have known, describing landmarks where more bodies could be found. The bend of Devil's Creek, the shaft of an abandoned mine, the roots of a great oak. Each revelation was proven true. Each one confirmed that the horror of Ashford Hollow stretched deeper than anyone had guessed. The turning point. On November 16th, the judge stood before the congregation once more. "The evidence is overwhelming," he declared. "This hollow was built upon murder and deceit. Its elders conspired to kill and conceal. The stolen coin raised your walls, filled your storehouses and bought your peace. That peace is ended." The people listened in stunned silence as the gavel fell upon the church's altar, striking wood that rang with a hollow echo. The hollow would face trial, not just the men in chains, but the community itself. Restitution would be demanded, homes sold, the settlement dissolved if necessary. But above all, the judge declared, "These children, though but 9 years old, have spoken truth no living witness could provide. Science cannot explain it, reason cannot confine it, but the law will not ignore it." The Harrow twins stood side by side as his words rang through the church. They looked neither triumphant nor afraid, only exhausted, their eyes fixed on something far beyond the walls of Ashford Hollow. Thus the Hollow stood on the brink of collapse, its leaders disgraced, its foundation exposed, its people facing ruin. The Harrow twins had torn open secrets buried for 16 years, and in doing so, had placed themselves at the very heart of a reckoning no one could escape. But the greater dread was yet to come, for the girls had hinted, in voices not their own, that the killings had not ended, that others had learned the methods of silence and concealment, that the trail of blood stretched forward into years still to come. Ashford Hollow had been unmasked, but the darkness it birthed had not yet been contained. By late November of 1834, Ashford Hollow was no longer governed by silence. The silence had been broken, shattered by the twins' uncanny testimony, and the bones unearthed beneath the church. Yet what replaced silence was not peace, it was dread, a dread, heavier than the air before a storm, clinging to every beam of every cabin, staining every prayer. The trial of the arrested elders had not yet begun, but Judge Ainsworth wasted no time in pursuing further inquiry. With Marcus Webb's counsel, and the reluctant cooperation of Pastor Pierce, he summoned every able-bodied man of the Hollow to assist in new excavation. The places the Harrow twins had named, the bend of Devil's Creek, the abandoned mine shaft, the great oak by the ridge, were to be unearthed. The Hollow obeyed, though unwillingly, for none could withstand the judge's authority. Yet as they gathered their spades and lanterns, their eyes kept straying to Catherine and Eliza Harrow, who stood pale and thin in the square. The twins spoke no words, but their silence was louder than thunder. The mine shaft. On November 20th, the men reached the shaft of the abandoned Ashford mine, once a source of coal and iron. It had collapsed a decade earlier, leaving a yawning wound in the earth. The timbers at its mouth were rotted, and the air that exhaled from its depths smelled of damp stone, and something fouler, something sweet and decayed. With ropes and lanterns, they descended. The mine groaned with each step, as if resenting intrusion. Judge Ainsworth, resolute, ordered the exploration to proceed. At 40 feet down, one of the men cried out. His lantern beam had fallen upon a mound of tattered cloth. When pulled free, it proved to be a coat, its lining stiff with dried blood. Beneath it lay bones, not one skeleton but many. The men dug with their hands, revealing skulls cracked by blunt force, ribs shattered, fingers curled as though clawing at air that would never return. The deputies counted 7 bodies before the descent grew too perilous. 7 more souls discarded like waste in the bowels of the earth. The oak tree. The following day they turned to the oak at the ridge, the tree the twins had named with such precision. Its roots stretched wide, clutching the soil like skeletal hands. Beneath them, shallow graves yielded more remains. Women this time, their dresses faded, but still intact, their hair preserved in brittle strands. Rings still clung to their fingers. A locket was found around one neck. Inside it a miniature portrait of a woman smiling, her name etched faintly. Men 1919. No one in the Hollow recognized her. The crowd that watched the digging wept openly, some for guilt, some for terror, some for recognition that the Hollow had never been safe. The twins weakening. Each discovery came at a price. For every body exhumed, the twins faltered further. Catherine collapsed on November 22nd, seizing in the square, until Ezekiel carried her home. Eliza grew fevered, muttering words in voices not her own, some masculine, some foreign, some too ancient to name. Pastor Pierce, though shaken in faith, visited them daily, recording their utterances. He noted, "They speak as if compelled by the dead themselves." Catherine cries out for air when none is wanting, clawing at her throat until blood wells from her nails. Eliza names men who vanished years before, describing the color of their eyes, the shape of their scars. It is not invention, it is inheritance passed into them without consent. The judge's dilemma. Judge Ainsworth faced a torment of reason. The law dealt in evidence, not in spectral voices. Yet every sight the girls described yielded precisely what they foretold. Each prophecy fulfilled made denial more impossible. In private he confided to Marcus Webb, "If I write this as it is, I destroy the law, for how can the testimony of children, unverified by natural means, be accepted in court? Yet if I dismiss it, I deny justice to the dead. I stand between reason and horror, and I fear neither will forgive me." The people's terror, the Hollow, already frayed, now began to unravel. Families who once clung to denial now packed their belongings, and fled under cover of night. Others turned fanatical, believing the twins not cursed but divine. Apostles sent to cleanse the Hollow of its sin. They knelt outside the Harrow cabin, leaving offerings of food and cloth, though the girls could barely eat. But there were those who cursed them still, widows of the accused elders, sons whose fathers now lay in chains. They muttered that the twins had poisoned the town,
that their visions were lies crafted by Satan to ruin the faithful, and thus the hollow split, not in two but in 1,000 pieces, each household its own island of fear. Marcus Webb's records. Throughout this, Marcus Webb documented every finding. His notebooks, written in a small, precise hand, remain the most complete account of those weeks. He measured skulls, drew diagrams of burial sites, catalogued objects. Yet his notes betray not only a solicitor's diligence, but a man wrestling with belief. In one margin he wrote, "No science of the body explains this. The twins have knowledge beyond sense, beyond transmission. I fear the word hereditary is too small. This is something carried in blood, yes, but not the blood of parents alone. It is as if the grave itself runs through their veins." The whisper of continuance. On November 24th, the girls spoke again, their voices rising in unison in the night. Ezekiel, desperate, roused the judge and Pastor Pierce to hear. Together they listened as Catherine and Eliza chanted, "Not ended, not ended. Ashford Hollow is but the first." Others learned, others carried. The blood is not buried. The blood. The words chilled them, for the implication was clear. The murders of 1818, 1820 were not isolated, not confined to Ashford Hollow. They were the beginning of a pattern, a contagion of crime and concealment that had spread beyond the rigid. Judge Ainsworth, his hands trembling, whispered, "If this is true, then no map can contain it. The hollow is but a symptom. The disease has already escaped." The closing of Part 6. Thus the inquiry deepened, not only the soil of Kentucky, but the conscience of every man and woman bound to its fate. The Harrow twins, frail and fevered, had become both witnesses and conduits. The law bent beneath truths it could neither measure nor deny. And as November waned, one certainty grew. The hollow's reckoning would not end with the bones it had buried. Something older, darker, and unexplainable had been set loose, and it would not be returned to the earth so easily. The final week of November 1834 brought not closure but inquiry. With bones retrieved from the church, the mine and the Oak Ridge, Judge Ainsworth was resolved to move the matter toward trial. Yet the hollow had ceased to be a place that could sustain orderly proceedings. Neighbors no longer spoke. Mothers kept their children inside at dusk. The air itself seemed fevered, as if waiting for one last revelation to tear the town apart. It was in this fragile state that Ainsworth summoned men of science, believing that what could not be explained by prayer or by law might yet yield to medical scrutiny. The physicians' arrival. On November 27th, 2 physicians rode into Ashford Hollow, Dr. Edmund Lawton of Louisville, and Dr. Samuel Crane of Lexington. Both were men of letters and reputation, though they carried the arrogance common to their profession. They came not for faith, but for proof, intent on examining the Harrow twins, whose utterances had shaken the town more thoroughly than any spade or gavel. Ezekiel Harrow resisted at first, refusing to expose his daughters to clinical gaze. Yet the judge persuaded him with solemn words, "If we cannot establish by science what they are, others will dismiss them as witches. I will not see children burned in effigy because we fail to apply reason." Reluctantly, Ezekiel consented. The examinations. The girls were brought to the parsonage, where the physicians laid them upon clean linen and commenced their examinations. Notes were taken, pulses measured, eyes studied by lamplight. Dr. Lawton observed, "The cranial formation of both girls is symmetrical, yet the fontanelle sutures remain slightly wider than is customary at their age. This may admit heightened sensitivity to impression, what the vulgar call visions." Dr. Crane disagreed, pressing fingers to Catherine's wrist. "The pulse races unnaturally when they are questioned on matters of the dead. I ascribe it to hysteria, contagious between the pair. There is nothing supernatural here, only a nervous sympathy between siblings." But when Eliza, eyes closed, whispered the precise contents of Crane's traveling case, a scalpel with an ivory handle, a vial of laudanum corked with red wax, a notebook bound in calfskin, the physician faltered, for these items were concealed within his saddlebag, never shown to the child. "Coincidence," Crane muttered, though his hands shook as he wrote the word. Anatomical theories. The physicians argued long into the night. Lawton suggested that heredity might play a role, that some peculiarity of the Harrow blood carried memory beyond the grave. He cited cases of families wherein madness, epilepsy, or visionary states appeared generation after generation, carried as faithfully as hair color or stature. Crane, though shaken, clung to natural explanation. He spoke of double consciousness, of sympathetic seizures between twins, of an overactive faculty of imagination inflamed by fever. Yet neither man could deny the accuracy of the girl's knowledge. When asked under controlled conditions to describe the contents of a locked chest in Ainsworth's quarters, Catherine recited each item with painful clarity: papers sealed with wax, a pistol loaded with a single ball, a miniature portrait of a woman with dark hair. The judge confirmed every detail, though he had never spoken of them aloud. Pastor Pierce's journal. Pierce, who had sat silently through the examinations, recorded in his journal: the doctors dissected them with words, as one might dissect a frog, yet found nothing to explain what even a child of the Hollow knows to be true. They are not witches, nor prophets, nor liars. They are vessels, but vessels of what? The question of heredity. When pressed about their ancestry, Ezekiel confessed haltingly that his wife, dead these 3 years, had been born of the Ashford line, distant kin to Elder Whitcomb himself. The revelation spread like contagion through the room. If true, then the Harrow twins bore not only their father's name, but the blood of those who had built the Hollow upon bones. They were descendants of the very crime they now unveiled. Marcus Webb, ever precise, noted the implication: perhaps what they reveal is not granted by heaven, nor inflicted by hell, but bred into them by blood, the sins of the fathers inscribed upon the flesh of the children. The phrase settled upon the gathering like dust, heavy and suffocate. The community's recoil. When word of this lineage escaped, the Hollow recoiled as one body. Some muttered that the twins' knowledge was not divine but hereditary guilt, that they carried in their veins the memories of the murderers, cursed to reveal what their forebears had concealed. Others argued the opposite, that precisely because of their blood, they had been chosen as instruments of justice, forced to expose the rot from within. The twins, caught between damnation and sanctification, withered under the weight of both. Catherine ceased speaking altogether for 2 days, refusing food. Eliza wandered the yard at night, tracing circles in the dirt until her feet bled. The law falters. Judge Ainsworth convened another hearing on November 29th. The church, its floorboards still gaping, served again as courtroom. He read aloud the physician's inconclusive reports, the solicitor's meticulous notes, and the testimonies of the Harrow twins as recorded by Pierce. Yet when it came to rendering judgment, his hand trembled. "How can I weigh this?" he asked aloud, voice break. "If I accept their words, I place the law beneath the weight of the inexplicable. If I reject them, I deny justice to the dead, who lie beneath our feet." The congregation offered no answer. Their faces were pale as stone. The twins' collapse. That night both Catherine and Eliza convulsed in their sleep. Ezekiel and Pierce rushed to their sides, but the seizures were unlike any ordinary fit. Their limbs moved in unison, their voices overlapping in guttural tones.
The bones rise. The earth is not finished. The blood remembers. The blood continues. When the fit subsided, their bodies lay so still that Ezekiel feared them dead. Hours passed before breath returned. Dr. Lockton declared their condition beyond the compass of medicine. Crane, humbled at last, whispered, "If this is hysteria, then hysteria itself is a curse." Thus the inquiry into the Harrow twins shifted from the soil to the body itself, from graves unearthed to blood inherited. Science bent against superstition, and both bent against the weight of something neither could explain. By November's end, Ashford Hollow no longer asked whether the twins spoke truth. The question had become far more terrible. Whose truth did they carry? Their own, or that of the very dead who built the Hollow's foundation? The trial loomed, yet so too did collapse. For the line between revelation and possession was narrowing, and the girls' frail bodies stood upon its edge. The first week of December 1834 opened with a cold wind sweeping down from the ridges, rattling the bare branches against cabin roofs. Ashford Hollow had ceased to be a functioning town. Its fields lay unworked, its shops unopened, and its streets littered with abandoned tools and shuttered doors. Families lingered only because Judge Ainsworth had commanded their presence at the forthcoming proceedings. The trial of Elder Whitcomb, Silas Harrow, and Nathaniel Gray, the last living architects of the Hollow's bloody foundation, was to begin, but no one called it by their name. The community whispered instead that Ashford Hollow itself was on trial, its very right to exist hanging in the balance. The makeshift courtroom, the old meeting house, stripped of its pews, became a courtroom. Rough benches were brought in. Windows were covered with oiled cloth to hold back the winter air. At the center, Judge Ainsworth sat at a table piled high with evidence, ledgers from the Whitcomb estate, blood-stained tools recovered from the mine, and the journals of victims long thought lost. Sheriff Caldwell brought in the accused, shackled at wrists and ankles. Elder Whitcomb, now frail, leaned upon a cane but still carried himself with an air of injured righteousness. Silas Harrow stared straight ahead, his jaw locked, while Nathaniel Gray kept his eyes low, as though the very floor might swallow him. In the gallery, Neighbors sat stiff as gravestones. Behind them, Catherine and Eliza Harrow clung to their father's arms, pale but resolute. Opening words. Judge Ainsworth rose. This court sits to determine not only the guilt of 3 men, but the foundation of a settlement. Crimes of robbery, murder, and concealment of human remains are alleged. Testimony of ordinary witnesses and extraordinary alike will be heard. The dead themselves have spoken through these children, and though the law knows no precedent for such voices, we will not close our ears. A murmur passed through the room. No one had expected him to invoke the twins so directly. The prosecution, Solicitor Marcus Webb, stood firm. His voice, though weary from weeks of labor, carried the solemn weight of accumulated evidence. 11 men are dead between 1818 and 1820. Their possessions appear in the records of the accused. 3 skeletons have been unearthed beneath this very church. 8 more cast into a mine shaft. The pattern is clear. Travelers were lured, slain, and stripped. The spoils raised Ashford Hollow. These are not accidents of wilderness, but murders deliberate and systematic. He lifted the silver-handled knife recovered with William Morse's remains. Its tarnished surface caught the lamplight. This blade alone speaks louder than I. It was pledged to Morse's widow as proof of his character. How came it buried with his bones unless by the hand of his killer? The silence that followed was broken only by the creak of benches as the accused shifted uneasily. The defense. No lawyer had volunteered to defend the men. Instead, Whitcomb himself spoke. He declared the evidence circumstantial, claimed the remains could not be tied beyond doubt, and accused the Harrow twins of demonic fancy. "Shall we condemn men upon the babble of Bay?" he thundered. "If every dream of a child may serve as indictment, none of us is safe." Yet even as he spoke, Catherine leaned into her father and whispered. Ezekiel rose, his voice trembling but firm. "My daughters see more than dreams. They see the twins called." When Catherine and Eliza were summoned to testify, the air thickened. No one breathed easily. The girls stood together at the front, small hands entwined. Marcus Webb asked only a single question. "Tell us, children, what lies in the mine beyond the 3rd chamber, where even we have not yet dug?" Eliza's eyes clouded. She spoke slowly. "A lantern, broken at the handle. A satchel with 3 letters in. A man with hair the color of wheat, his skull crushed. His name was Jonathan Ward. His wife still waits in Tennessee." Gasps filled the hall. Sheriff Caldwell looked to the judge, then bolted from the room with 2 deputies to verify the claim. Collapse of the defense. Whitcomb sputtered, declaring fraud, but the trial paused until the sheriff returned hours later, mud on his boots and horror in his eyes. He laid the satchel upon the judge's table, the letters still inside, each signed Jonathan Ward. The effect was final. Whitcomb's protests died in his throat. Silas Harrow buried his face in his hands. Nathaniel Gray began to weep openly, his thin shoulders shaking. Confessions. Under mounting pressure, Nathaniel Gray confessed. His voice was hoarse, but every word rang with fatal clarity. "It was Whitcomb who taught us. Said the Lord would forgive so long as we used the money for holy purpose. I struck 2 men myself. Silas more. Whitcomb most of all. We buried them where the church now stands. God forgive me." Silas Harrow confirmed the account with bitter brevity. Only Whitcomb refused, swearing until the end that the devil had placed false memories in the twins. But the tide had turned. No one believed him now. The sentence. Judge Ainsworth pronounced the verdict on December. "Elder Whitcomb, Silas Harrow, Nathaniel Gray, you are guilty of multiple murders, robbery and concealment of the dead. By the laws of Kentucky, you are condemned to hang until dead. May God have mercy on your souls." A shudder swept the room. Though most had anticipated the sentence, hearing it spoken aloud felt like the severing of the Hollow's last thread of pretense. Judgment on the community. Yet Ainsworth did not stop there. He spoke also to the assembled townsfolk. This place itself is complicit. Its church and houses razed with stolen coin, its peace purchased by silence. Therefore, Ashford Hollow shall be dissolved, its properties sold, proceeds rendered to the families of the slain. What remains will be consecrated anew as ground of memorial. The settlement you knew is ended. The words struck harder than the hangman's decree. Men and women began to weep openly, not for Whitcomb or Harrow, but for the loss of their homes, their identity, their claim upon the land. The twins' final warning. Before dismissal, Catherine lifted her voice one last time. "It is not finished. The blood taught others. Even if these men hang, the Hollow's shadow will stretch. You must look beyond.
into the ridges, the trails, the caves. There are more voices waiting. Her words left the room colder than the December wind. Aftermath of the day. That night families huddled in cabins, knowing they would soon scatter to other towns. Some cursed the twins for their ruin, others blessed them for their honesty. Pastor Pierce walked the lanes with lantern in hand, praying aloud though no one joined him. Ezekiel kept watch over his daughters, who slept fitfully, whispering names he did not recognize. He wondered whether their burden had only begun. The closing of Part 8. Thus ended the formal trial of Ashford Hollow, but no one mistook it for an end. The verdict condemned not just men but the very soil, the timbers, the graves beneath. A town died in a single week, strangled by the truth its children had spoken. Yet as Catherine foretold, the shadows stretched, more trails, more disappearances, more graves The law had hanged its culprits, but the mystery of the Harrow twins and the voices of the dead remained unresolved, pressing ever outward into the dark hills of Kentucky. The morning of December 12, 1834, dawned gray and heavy, as though the heavens themselves carried the weight of Ashford Hollow's sins. A thin crust of frost silvered the fields, and smoke rose from fewer chimneys than ever before. The town that once bustled with sermons and market days, now resembled a settlement of ghosts, awaiting its final judgment. For the condemned, Elder Whitcomb, Silas Harrow, and Nathaniel Gray, the judgment was at hand. The gallows had been erected on a bare knoll just beyond the meeting house, its timbers hewn from the very pines that had shaded the Hollow's earliest homesteads. The walk to the gallows. Sheriff Caldwell led the prisoners from the stockade at dawn. Each man wore simple linen, their shackles clinking with every step. Soldiers from Lexington flanked the procession, rifles at the ready. Whitcomb moved slowly, leaning hard on his cane. His lips murmured ceaseless prayers, or perhaps cursing. Silas Harrow strode stiffly, his jaw locked, a man determined not to tremble before his daughters. Nathaniel Gray stumbled often, as if each step grew heavier than the last. Behind them came Judge Ainsworth, Pastor Pierce and Marcus Webb. The gallery of townsfolk followed in silence, boots crunching against the frozen ground. Mothers clutched children close. Fathers carried the look of men who had labored for years only to see their labors turn to dust. And among them walked Ezekiel Harrow with Catherine and Eliza. The twins were pale, their eyes rimmed with sleeplessness, but they did not falter. The voices of the dead had not left them. The gathering. Upon the knoll, nearly the whole valley had assembled. Some came from miles beyond the hollow, drawn by rumor and dread. Farmers from neighboring settlements stood shoulder to shoulder with those who had once called Whitcomb their shepherd. The gallows loomed above them, 3 ropes swaying lightly in the winter breeze. The crowd shifted uneasily. No one cheered. No one. They had come not for spectacle but to witness the closing of a chapter that had poisoned them all. Last words. Judge Ainsworth asked if the condemned had any final words. Nathaniel Gray spoke first, voice quavering. I was young, and I feared Elder Whitcomb more than I feared God. I struck blows I cannot undo. If any kin of Jonathan Ward or William Morse yet live, know that I am sorry, that is all. Silas Harrow lifted his chin, eyes seeking Catherine and Eliza. My girls, forgive me. I kept silent when I should have spoken. I let Whitcomb's promises chain me, and in that silence men died. May you live in truth, not in shadows as I did.
Catherine wept, but Eliza whispered something only her sister heard. Both nodded solemnly. At last Whitcomb straightened as much as his frail body allowed. His voice carried farther than expected. This is not justice but blasphemy. These children are deceivers, their visions witchcraft. When I am gone, the hollow will fall into chaos, and you will curse yourselves for striking down your shepherd. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but no voice rose to defend him. His words carried no weight now. The hanging Sheriff Caldwell gave the signal. Black hoods were drawn over the men's heads. The crowd fell into utter stillness. Only the wind groaned across the ridge. The trapdoors dropped. 3 bodies jerked violently, then hung swaying against the pale sky. One rope creaked, another snapped taut. Whitcomb's cane clattered to the ground. Silas's boots scraped against the timber. Nathaniel gave a final shuddering gasp. Minutes passed before Caldwell declared them dead. The bodies were cut down to be buried not in consecrated soil but in an unmarked pit at the edge of the woods. Few cared where. The hollow's unraveling. The executions did not bring relief. Instead they deepened the town's unraveling. Judge Ainsworth kept his word. Ashford Hollow was dissolved. Families packed wagons, sold livestock, and scattered toward safer towns. Lexington, Louisville, even across the Ohio River. Houses stood empty within weeks. Roofs sagged beneath winter snow. The mine shaft was sealed with heavy stones. The church stripped of its bell and timbers. The very name of Ashford Hollow became one that mothers warned against whispering after dusk. Catherine and Eliza felt every departure like a wound. With each wagon rolling away, new voices pressed upon them, pleading for remembrance. Some were those already unearthed. Others strangers yet undiscovered. Do not leave us here. Tell them my name. I walked this road once. Do not let it swallow me again. The girls clung to Ezekiel, who could give no comfort. He wondered whether the gallows had ended anything at all. The outsider's verdict. Newspapers across Kentucky printed lurid accounts of the trial and hangings. Some hailed the Harrow twins as prophets of justice. Others derided them as children exploited by greed. Learned men in Lexington scoffed at the notion of spectral testimony, insisting the case relied on earthly evidence alone. But in taverns and parlors the tale took on a darker shimmer. People whispered of a cursed settlement, of twins who could see beneath the skin of the world, of a valley where even scripture could not silence the dead. Travelers avoided the ridges. Maps began omitting the name Ashford Hollow altogether. The twins' night of fire. On the final night before their departure, Catherine and Eliza begged their father to take them once more to the meeting house. He relented, though unease gnawed at him. Inside, the benches lay overturned, dust thick upon the pulpit. Yet the girls moved with purpose. They knelt upon the floorboards where the first bones had been found. Together they whispered a prayer, half petition, half warning. As they prayed, a lantern overturned. Flames licked at the dry timber. Ezekiel rushed to quench it, but Catherine held his sleeve. Let it burn, she whispered. The dead do not want this place to remain. And so it burned. By dawn the meeting house was a charred skeleton, smoke curling into the pale winter sky. No one wept for it. Departure. The Harrows left Ashford Hollow in the company of Marcus Webb and a handful of families who had nowhere else to go. Their wagons creaked northward, leaving behind only blackened timbers, sealed shafts and the unmarked graves of both victims and perpetrators. As the ridge swallowed the last view of the valley, Catherine looked back. She did not cry. She only murmured, "It isn't finished. The ridges still hold voices." Eliza echoed her softly, "And they will find us, wherever we go." Thus the gallows ended the lives of 3 men, but could not cleanse the land. Ashford Hollow dissolved into ruin, its memory already mutating into legend. Yet the burden of the dead traveled with the twins, etched into their every breath, promising that Kentucky's wilderness still held darker reckonings to come. The trial had ended, the executions completed, but the true mystery, the voices that not even science could explain, only grew louder. The first frost of January 1835 found the Harrows no longer in Ashford Hollow. The valley had emptied, its cabins surrendered to silence, its fields to briar and frost. Only crows nested among the chimneys, and the charred frame of the meeting house stood like a monument to a god who had turned his face away. Ezekiel, with Catherine and Eliza, joined a caravan of displaced families bound for Lexington. The road was long and cruel. Wagons splintered in the mud. Oxen stumbled and died. Yet the greater burden was invisible. Wherever they camped, the twins heard voices, not only those of the Hollow's dead, but others, unmoored and wandering, pressed. The wilderness, they learned, was filled with bones. The first town. When they reached the outskirts of Lexington, they were received with wary hospitality. The tale of Ashford Hollow had preceded them, half cautionary sermon, half tavern entertainment. Neighbors eyed the girls with curiosity edged by fear. At supper tables whispers arose. Are these the children who named bones under floorboards, who made old Whitcomb swing? Some dismissed them as fraud. Others watched Catherine and Eliza with reverence, as though in them lay proof of divine justice. But the twins offered no spectacle. They were thin, wan, silent. Catherine would not meet a stranger's gaze. Eliza flinched at sudden noise, and when pressed they said only, "The hollow is finished, but the dead are not." The physicians' report. Dr. Lofton and Dr. Crane, who had returned to their universities, published a joint report in early February. It circulated in learned circles under the title, "A Clinical Account of the Harrow Children." The treatise described their seizures of sympathetic memory, their visions consistent with hysteria, and nervous contagion. Yet buried deep within the text was an admission neither man could erase. Certain utterances, corresponded with concealed facts impossible for the subjects to have known. We can only conclude that the phenomenon remains unresolved within present medical understanding. The report was ridiculed in some journals, cautiously admired in others. For the public it served only to deepen the twins' notoriety. The aftermath of families scattered from the hollow struggled to root themselves elsewhere. The Greys disappeared into Tennessee. The Whitcomb name was abandoned altogether, and Silas Harrow's widow, who had refused to leave her hearth, was found dead by spring, her body half consumed by wolves, her cabin door ajar. Those who fled carried stories that would not die. Some swore that Catherine and Eliza could summon details of their kin long buried. Others swore the girls avoided graveyards altogether, as though too many voices would crush them. The girls' decline. By summer, Catherine grew listless. She seldom spoke, and when she did, her words unsettled even Ezekiel. They follow us, she murmured one night by the fire. Not only from the hollow, everywhere. Voices in the water, in the stones. We are never alone. Eliza, once the bolder of the two, suffered fevers that left her raving, clutching at her chest as if to pull something out. Marcus Webb, who still visited, feared for their survival. This is no ordinary grief, he told Ezekiel. They are consumed by something the rest of us cannot see. Perhaps it is memory woven too tightly into their blood. Perhaps it is judgment. Ezekiel had no answer. He prayed, but prayer brought no relief. The spread of the legend. By 1836, newspapers as far as New York and Boston printed distorted accounts. Some claimed the Harrow twins had unearthed hundreds of skeletons. Others insisted they had prophesied plague, or fire, or war. The truth, already blurred in the hollow, became a tapestry of half-remembrance, embroidered with fear. Preachers thundered against children who traffic with spirits. Folklorists recorded their names as if they were figures of myth. And yet when travelers stopped in Lexington, they asked quietly where the Harrow girls might be found, as though a glimpse might confirm that death itself could speak. The silence of Ezekiel. Ezekiel aged rapidly under the strain. He spoke rarely, worked little, and carried the air of a man already in mourning. Some neighbors pitied him, others accused him of profiting from his daughter's notoriety. But Ezekiel neither defended nor explained himself. He tended his daughters, drew shutters, tight at dusk, and muttered of a valley where justice had never been satisfied. In his pocket he carried a small notebook, Pierce's final gift, its pages filled with names of the forgotten dead. He guarded it as though it were scripture. Pastor Pierce's last note. Pierce himself, broken by the collapse of his congregation, withdrew to a monastery in the bluegrass. From there he penned one final letter to Ainsworth. We thought to silence the bones with law, but the bones have their own law. The Harrow girls are not prophets. They are archives. If God has written his judgment into their flesh, then who are we to undo it? Yet I fear what such a burden will make of them in years to come. The letter never reached print, but it survived among Ainsworth's papers. Ainsworth's withdrawal, the judge once respected across the state, resigned within a year. He refused further cases, claiming his judgment could no longer be trusted after the hollow. Some said he dreamed of Catherine and Eliza nightly, standing in his court, naming secrets he had never spoken aloud. He left for Ohio, where he died in obscurity. The whispered warning. By the late 1830s, only a few remembered Ashford Hollow as it truly was. The valley itself became overgrown. Its cabins collapsed, its paths lost to briar. Yet hunters swore that if one lingered near the ridge at dusk, one could hear children's voices calling names no living mouth remembered. Some returned shaken, claiming they had heard their own names whispered on the wind. Resolution. And so the hollow ended not with gallows nor fire, but with dispersal. Families scattered, a church blackened, a valley erased from map. Yet its curse endured in the frail bodies of Catherine and Eliza, in the reports of physicians baffled, in the sleepless prayers of those who once called the place home. The dead had been spoken, but not silenced. What was inherited, what was inherited, what was carried in blood, had not been undone. Even now, in certain Kentucky hollows, one hears tales of two pale children who wander between towns, never aging, always listening. Some say they are shadows of the Harrow twins. Others insist they are the twins themselves, spared death, and condemned to remembrance. So remember this. If you ever walk the ridges of Kentucky and hear a voice speak your name when no one is near,
Do not answer, for it may not be the living who call. They are still listening, and they are never finished.